They have likewise discovered two lesser stars, or satellites, which revolve about Mars, whereof the innermost is distant from the center of the primary planet exactly 3 of his diameters, and the outermost 5. The former revolves in the space of 10 hours, and the latter in 21 and a half, so that the squares of their periodical times are very near in the same proportion with the cubes of their distances from the center of Mars, which evidently shows them to be governed by the same law of gravitation that influences the other heavenly bodies. That is an excerpt from a book entitled Gulliver's Travels, written by Jonathan Swift in 1726. That excerpt that I just read you should not have been possible to exist in any form whatsoever. As I said, this book was published in 1726. Phobos and Deimos, the 2 moons of Mars, would not be discovered until 151 years later. How the hell did Jonathan Swift know about Phobos and Deimos? Now, this is not a new problem. I am not the first person to point out this situation. This is a well-known literary issue. There's no question about that. But what is going on here? How is it that an author living in the 1700s not only knows about Phobos and Deimos, 2 moons which, by the way, are incredibly tiny, right? Phobos and Deimos are not like gigantic moons. They are nothing like what we have around here on Earth. In fact, if you want to get technical about it, you might even be able to kind of make an argument that says they aren't even moons, right? They're more like just space garbage floating around Mars. And the reason why I say this is because both moons are incredibly tiny. So, for example, Phobos has a diameter of only 14 miles. That's all it is. This is nothing huge, right? And it's, it's all lumpy and irregularly shaped. I mean, basically, it looks like a potato, right? This is not really a moon in the sense of a planetary body in the way we think about moons nowadays. It's more like just a giant asteroid, right? Now, when we look over at Deimos, Deimos is even tinier. Right, Deimos is only, I think, 7.8 miles in diameter. It's not huge. It's nothing, right? It's literally just a giant rock out there floating around Mars. Now, the reason why this is a problem is because in the 1700s, they did not have the technology capable of seeing these 2 moons. Now, astronomy was well on its way of witnessing things, right? We knew about some moons around Jupiter and stuff like that. I believe they knew about the rings of Saturn at this point in time. Yeah, they knew about the rings. I think the rings were discovered in the early 1600s. I think it was 1610 even. Anyway, the point is that, yeah, astronomy was on its way to making all kinds of cool discoveries. However, Phobos and Deimos, there was no way to see those 2 tiny little specks orbiting Mars. And, no astronomer claims that they existed. But why does Jonathan Swift, for some weird reason, make this claim? Now, Jonathan Swift's claim gets even crazier when you realize that this dude literally describes the sizes of the moons and their orbits around Mars. This is a serious problem. The passage is insane because he goes out of his way to describe literally in scientific notation, the orbits of the moons and the sizes of the moons. So for example, let's go back to the quote. Whereof the innermost is distant from the center of the primary planet exactly 3 of his diameters. So, Jonathan Swift also knows essentially the exact size of Mars as well. That's pretty good. That's fairly impressive. So, the inner moon is Phobos. and he essentially describes almost perfectly the orbit of Phobos using the diameter of Mars as his measuring stick. There's a few fairly impressive things going on right there, right? Now, he's not perfect, and we'll get to that in a sec, right? So now if we go and we look over at Deimos, Swift makes the claim that Deimos' orbit is 5 Mars diameters, all right? So it's already kind of weird right off the bat that some guy in the 1700s is willing to make these kind of claims at all. Now, back then, everybody just wrote this stuff off as science fiction, because that's basically what the book is anyways. It's just a work of fiction. Well, maybe, I don't know, because the more you start to look at this stuff, the more he seems to have some pretty good information on things that originally seemed to be fiction. Right? So, for example, this moon problem that we're dealing with. Okay, anyway. All right, so we have a problem. All right, we have an issue that, for some weird reason, Swift is aware of the sizes of these 2 moons that have not been discovered yet, and he is also aware of their orbits. All right, so check okay, before we go further, let's break down how impressive this really is. Because right now, when literary scholars look at this particular passage in this book, they have decided that somehow Jonathan Swift just got lucky. That's it. He got lucky. He took his guess, and we moved on. Right? That is absolutely mind-numbingly insane to think. So let me contextualize why that perspective is ridiculous. All right. So Jonathan Swift gets 2 moons correct. He goes on ahead and estimates their sizes, which are also essentially correct. And then he takes it even further and is even happier to tell us their orbits, right? So, for example, he gives us an orbit of 10 hours for Phobos and 21 and a half hours for Deimos. Now, the reality is the orbits that we witness today is that Phobos orbits Mars in about 7.5 hours or so, and Deimos clocks in around 30-ish hours. So you have a 2.5 hour distance for Phobos, and you have a 9-hour distance for Deimos. That's that's not too bad. That is not too shabby. I mean, that is one hell of a guess. If Jonathan Swift took a guess for no reason at all to put 2 moons around Mars and even describe their sizes and their orbits, why? Why would you even do that? I mean, what's the purpose of that? Why not make 20 moons? Why not make 0 moons? He could have done 0 moons. I don't know. But for some weird reason, Swift decides to almost perfectly describe the orbits of those moons and their sizes. This really does beg the question, how did he know? You can take the literary scholar's side, I get it, and you can say, well, he just guessed, he got lucky. Or if you want to try to go down a little more of a scientific route, you could say something to the effect of, well, you had Kepler over there and Voltaire, and they were trying to, they also imagined that there were moons around Mars, right? So imagining moons around Mars is easy. That's not complicated. Earth has a moon. We knew Saturn and Jupiter had a moon, or moons, I should say. So, we have precedents for moons. So guessing that Mars might have a moon or 2 is not interesting in and of itself. But when Swift goes out of his way to give us scientific specifications for 2 moons, which are difficult to spot anyways, that's a problem. I mean, really? If we use common sense, what makes more sense? That he guessed all of that scientific knowledge almost perfectly, just out of nowhere, for no reason at all? Or did Jonathan Swift have access to some other scientific documentation or mythology that we do not have access to now? Which makes more sense? I would argue easily and scientifically that Swift had access to some form of astronomical knowledge of which we no longer possess. Because right here in writing, in a dated writing, we have the specifications of Mars and its satellites already set up, good to go. and it's in scientific notation. What this tells us is that something else is going on a scientific level. Jonathan Swift did not guess about Phobos and Deimos. He didn't do that. He's way too accurate to have made a guess like that. The statistics, and it's a near zero probability that Jonathan Swift would have guessed that stuff correctly. Now, if you want to push back immediately, one of the things you can say right now is, well, yes, he came close to the orbits, and while that is impressive, he did not have the exact orbits. Yeah, and I agree, right? He's off a little bit in there. He's off a few miles on each of the moon's orbits. But there might be a reason why that is. All right, we'll cover that in a sec. But let's start at the beginning here. Let's look at this problem at the main foundation, and let's see if we can deduce something else here that will open up an entire other world of possibilities relative to history and relative to the last major catastrophe that our ancestors suffered. So right now I'm calling that last major catastrophe the Zero Event. And the Zero Event was ushered in by several close encounters with the planet Mars. Now, this event only took place around 1,000 years ago. I do not have an exact date, and I apologize for that, but right now chronology is fuzzy as hell. So I say around 1,000 years because it's not going to be exactly 1,000 years. That's just what the evidence points towards at the moment. The ballpark numbers in all reality could be anywhere as early as 700 years ago up to around maybe 1,100, maybe 1,200 years ago. Now, I know some of that sounds crazy, especially, 700 years ago. That might even sound crazier, and I'm sort of on board with that because that's also too soon. But the only reason why I mention the possibility of maybe 7 centuries ago is because that's what the evidence kind of supports here and there. Right, now I'm not done studying this, and we all have a ton more to learn and find and everything. But what's interesting is that, man, this event seems to come closer and closer to us in time relative to what the scientific and historical evidence really is supporting. Now, 700 is probably too early, and I agree with that, right? But it could be as early as 800. That's actually starting to become more of the number that's making a lot more sense scientifically. And I know that sounds crazy, but okay. Anyway, so what's going on here? Really quick. The idea is, and I didn't create this idea, by the way. I made none of these discoveries. This is what our ancestors claim. Like, I did not wake up one morning and have a schizo, freak out and said, holy crap, I think about 1,000 years ago, Mars almost collided with Earth. Like, I didn't do any of that. That's not me. The only reason why this conclusion is being made is because that's what our ancestors claim. Right? This was the God in the sky that everybody talks about. For example, I'm not going to go too deep into any of this stuff because I want to focus on the space side of things in this show. But if you look at Rome, right, what's the heralding planet of Rome? Right, it's Mars. Right, Mars is the central planet for the creation of Rome. And even if you believe in the mainstream chronology, that wasn't that long ago. Right? If Mars is the planet that heralds in Rome, that means that, about 2,000 years ago or so. Now, obviously, that's not 1,000 years ago, but that's because I'm factoring in real chronology and the mainstream isn't. But even if you take a purely mainstream perspective, this still puts Mars close to Earth only 2,000 years ago. Right? That's how recent this stuff is, even in the mainstream. Right? But this is the kind of stuff we find in history. Rome is not the only example of Mars coming in during this period in time and taking a huge role in people's histories and mythologies. This happens all over the world. All you have to do is some very basic comparative mythology, and you will find that as Rome is doing its, Mars revelations and stuff, as they start to revere the planet Mars, so does everybody else. Right? The North American Indians are doing the exact same thing. South American people are doing the exact same. Everybody is dealing with Mars, and the reason why is simple. It is because Mars made several close encounters with the Earth, and everybody saw it. Everybody saw it. Right? It was right there. You couldn't miss it. It was a giant red planet that was probably larger in the sky than the moon is today. I mean, could you imagine that? Could you imagine seeing Mars that close to Earth? This is potentially what they saw. Now, I don't have proof that it was quite that big in the sky. I'm just saying that's one of the possibilities. It was probably at least as big as the moon is now today, though. And I mean relative in size. I don't mean like Mars shrank or grew or anything. I mean, relatively, the distance, the perspective. Don't be a smartass. Right? But it had to be a decent size because one of the things that we find during this period in history that everybody talks about is that for some weird reason, a lot of people are able to describe the surface features of Mars. Right? That's how close it was. Valles Marineris, everybody could see it. Right? It was all, it already had the scar. As far as I know, Mars already had Valles Marineris. And Valles Marineris came to being, our ancestors watched this happen as well. But the reason why Mars gets that huge canyon scar across the face of its surface is during the Venus event. And that's an event that our ancestors witnessed as well. Right? They saw that happen. Anyways, so when Mars is coming close, that's why you find a situation to where people call it the scarred war god. Scarface, etc. It's because they could see the damn thing right there. It was right there. You did not need a telescope to see it. That's how close Mars ends up coming to the Earth. Now, it's really important to understand a couple of things here. Yeah, I'll get to the main part of this show, but I want to make sure that we understand the foundations of the claims. Because I don't want people shutting this stuff off just because it sounds crazy initially. Remember, everything I'm talking about is based on science and history. That's it. If I don't have any kind of information regarding one of those two things, it's speculation at best, and I'll tell you it's speculation. So right now, I'm just dealing with science and history. That's it. Everything I've said so far is not me. This is science and history. This is what our ancestors claim. All right, anyway, so a couple of things to remember during the Zero event. The Zero event is nowhere near as destructive as the Venus event. It's a completely different situation. The Venus event literally reshapes the entire surface of the planet. Right, literally. Right, that's where the mountain ranges come from. That's where oceans shift around. That's where we literally lost continents and gained some land, apparently. Right, that was a whole chaotic mess. And that was around 2,000 years ago. Right. When Mars shows up, Mars does not cause anywhere near that kind of destruction. But that does not mean it does not cause destruction. It's also important to understand that Mars does not collide with Earth. Right? There's nothing crazy like that going on. It does not physically hit each other. Sometimes you will hear in this area of study, you'll hear the word collision used, especially if you read Velikovsky. Velikovsky is not talking about two physical planets colliding. He's talking about two planets essentially electrically seeing at one another. He's talking about their electromagnetic fields colliding. And then, of course, the fallout from what happens with that. All right, so I try not to use the word collision because I don't feel it's accurate anyway. But just remember, when we say that Mars comes close to Earth, that's all it does. It doesn't bump into Earth. There's nothing like that. You don't need to have... Because some theories, like, I forgot that one guy's name. He probably did a lot of damage to the whole thing. But he's got, like, moons crashing into the Earth and all this crazy stuff. It's nothing like that. There's nothing like that going on. Mars just does several close flybys of Earth. Now, the god of war, Mars, apparently does multiple flybys of the planet Earth. It's not just one and then it's gone. This is important to remember, and it seems like for a chunk of time there, and I don't know how long, this probably only lasts maybe a century, maybe a half a century, to where Mars comes close to Earth every 12 years. So if you want to corroborate anything that I'm talking about, go look for a period of 12-year cycles relative to a god of war, relative to, the scarred god, relative to the great red one. Whatever culture discusses Mars more recently, if you use the 12-year cycle, or this 12-year concept, and you go and you look at other cultures' calendars and stuff, you're going to find this all over the place. What this shows us is that whatever the hell was going on with the orbits back then, Venus was happy where it is now. Venus had already essentially, well, sort of settled. Well, Venus gets weird. I'm not going to say that. Venus gets weird. But Venus is not a player in this at all. She doesn't matter at this point in time. It's just Mars. Right? But I don't know what Mars's orbit was like. I don't know if Mars was if Mars was crossing Earth's orbit, or if Mars was just always on an outside orbit and we just came close here and there. I don't know the orbits, and I'm not sure if we were crossing paths or whatever. Remember, the Venus event, Venus literally crosses Earth's orbit, right? Venus was trying to get to where it is now. It came from a further out position and moved closer to the sun. That's what Venus did. Mars obviously went in the opposite direction, but Mars may have already been out there as well and never crossed our orbit. That's entirely possible. All right. So you guys get it. That's the foundation of the zero event thesis. So Mars is the central player. The reason why Gulliver's Travels is so interesting is because Jonathan Swift is describing Mars to a T. And he's describing the planet in a way that should have been impossible relative to his time period. Right, so that's already an impressive feat, but what does that really mean? What kind of an insight can we get from what's going on here? Right, because most people have probably nowadays, especially, never heard of Gulliver's Travels. But, here we have in this book some incredibly important scientific information. And it's completely ignored by historians and scientists. Well, let's not ignore it. Let's look at it. Let's see what the implications are for this existing. So the first thing we can ask is, did Jonathan Swift have some kind of a super mega telescope? And the reality is no. There's no reason to believe that Jonathan Swift had some sort of super technology that other people did not have, and he was able to see these things, right? There's no reason to believe that. So we can get rid of that possibility. The next possibility, maybe he was just lucky. Yeah, fine, you can make that claim, and obviously there's very little I can do to completely disprove it. But statistically speaking, like I already said, it's so close to zero that it's not even worth entertaining. Sorry, we just have to call it for what it is. I'm not going to sit here and have anybody tell me that this dude just got lucky with that kind of a situation. There's no reason for that to have happened at all. So what does that leave us with? If we're honest with ourselves, very few options are now available. One of the interesting things, though, is that we have a realistic option left. And I already kind of mentioned it, but is it possible that Jonathan Swift had access to other sources that we do not have access to now? Now, on the surface of this might sound crazy to your average historian or astronomer, because your average historian and astronomer believes the garbage stuff, right? They believe in the theory of uniformity. They think that the planets have been orbiting in their current orbits for billions of years. Right? Historians believe that our ancestors were all monkeys up until about 100 years ago, basically. So it would be impossible, really, for anybody to know the kind of stuff that Jonathan Swift is claiming. So he must have guessed it, right? So that's where that comes from. However, if we employ real chronology and we employ real plasma physics and electric magnetism, if we look at the universe through real science and real history, suddenly we find a situation, something like the zero event. We find a situation to where our ancestors who claim that Mars did several close flybys of Earth, we find a situation to where that's possible. That is a scientific possibility. Like, there's nothing that proves anything that cannot happen. So maybe that did happen. And if it did happen, that means it was only around 1,000 years ago, which is not that long ago. So is it possible that somebody at some point in time in the past, the relatively recent past, had a front row seat to see Mars in its current configuration that we find it now, just except in a different orbit? Would that now be a possibility? Is it possible that somebody ended up documenting Mars on its way away from the planet Earth to go to where it orbits now, and they didn't need a telescope to see the configuration of Mars and its moons? Right? Suddenly, this problem becomes a non-issue. So here, let's clear this up a little bit. Let's walk through what would have happened during this event. So during the zero event, Mars shows up multiple times, as I've already said a million times. I know, I keep repeating myself. Right? And with Mars comes apparently a trail of debris and other problems. Now, when we look at Mars right now, Mars does not have tons of debris orbiting around it. It's got its two little moons, and I'm sure there's little bits of junk up there, but basically nobody looks at Mars and the stuff around Mars and says, wow, that's a huge debris field over there. It's not there. However, that's not the way that our ancestors describe it. The way our ancestors describe the planet Mars approaching Earth is that it has all kinds of demons with it, or horses, or other descriptors that mythologies use to describe all of these meteorites flowing with Mars. Ha, see? Something to think about. Now, all of a sudden, when you go back and you look at mythologies and you hear about, all these burning horses riding in the sky and carrying chariots and all this garbage, or you hear about demons in the sky, right? The demon perspective is very common all over the planet. Demons in the sky came with the war god and blah, 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 blah. It all sounds like crazy fiction. However, if you replace the word demon, or you replace the word horse, or in other cases you'll find there's all kinds of descriptors, but another popular one is warriors, right? All the soldiers, all the burning soldiers, stuff like that. If you replace those analogies with the word meteorites or space debris, suddenly demons make sense. Suddenly horses in the sky make sense. Because now they're not physically demons, right? They're not little horned goblins running around. They're not horses riding around in the sky. No, what our ancestors were doing is they were describing what they were witnessing happening up in the sky relative to space debris. And you would have all kinds of things going on with that debris. You would have debris spinning out of control. This is where some of the wheels come from, where some of those spirals will come from. You will have other debris trailing all kinds of other matter, dust, and debris. You will have cometary bodies within that debris. Because that whole debris area around Mars would have been electrically active to some degree or another. It would have been dealing with its plasma problems. And of course, as it gets closer to Earth, the electrical environment is going to shift, and you're going to have all kinds of other effects start to pop up in the sky. Some of that debris is going to interact with the magnetic field of Earth in various ways, right? Depending on the charges of the bodies. So this is where you start to get all of these descriptors for crazy, things happening up in the sky. These aren't fictional tales. Our ancestors were simply describing to the best of their ability what they were witnessing happening in the sky. That's it. That's it. There's your explanation for all of those mythologies. No crazy religious explanations required. We can just do a better job at understanding what these people were talking about. Now, if you're wondering why Mars would have a huge cloud of debris with it, well, this is something we would expect. If all of the other catastrophes happened, right? If the Saturnian configuration to one degree or another was real, if the Venus event actually happened, we would expect Mars to still possess some of the fallout from those events, especially the Venus event. Because like I said earlier, apparently the Venus event is where Mars gets Valles Marines. Like that is where that entire canyon is carved. There was a giant thunderbolt that shot from Venus and smashed into Mars. And it just carves out the surface of that planet, right? It just carves out all of that giant canyon. Well, that debris had to go somewhere, right? That had to go somewhere. It doesn't just vaporize and vanish, at least not all of it. That event was so extreme, what it did is that it literally ejected all kinds of Mars strata up into Mars's orbit. This is more than likely where Phobos and Deimos came from. Phobos and Deimos are more than likely just huge chunks of the Martian strata. That's more than likely what those two guys are. But before Mars turns into what we see now, all of that debris still would have been floating around Mars once Mars and Venus disengaged from each other and the Earth. Right? Mars still would have been carrying that debris. So where did that debris go? Well, I'm sure that some of it would have eventually fell back to Mars, over time. Oh, by the way, if you look at the surface of Mars, I'll make another explanation for you guys just to prove that this is probably what happened. If you look at Mars, one of the problems with Mars is that Mars is covered in just pebble-like pebbles everywhere, right? Little bits of rock just scattered all over hell and back. Geologists have no explanation for this. We do. All of those little scattered, little smaller rocks and pebbles and chunks that are just literally covered almost the entire planet. That is the material that would have rained down after the explosion of Valles Marineris. That's where all that stuff came from, right? There's a perfectly simple scientific explanation for why the surface of Mars looks like it does. It's right there. It's not hidden. It's right there. Anyway, so I only say that just to build up more of a case, just in case this sounds too schizo. Anyway, so, Mars would have had its cloud of debris for a little while there. It would have lost some of it to various things. And it's also entirely possible that Mars has encounters with other bodies that we're just not aware of. Right? Our ancestors can only record what they can see. And they cannot see the entire solar system all the time. It's not possible. So it's entirely possible that Mars has another encounter with somebody else. And who knows what really happened. Either way, when Mars shows up closing in on Earth around 1,000 years ago, our ancestors can still see debris around the planet. When Mars starts to get closer, like I said earlier, we're going to have electromagnetic effects. We are going to see the effects of electricity and plasma up in the sky. And it would have been one hell of a show. Right, this is where all of those crazy, descriptions come from. These people are watching these insane plasmatic events happening up in the sky, and the modern people, you and me, we have no reference for any of this stuff. Like, our sky is completely boring. There's nothing going on. If we were to see a true plasma event, well, a comet is a plasma event. That's about the long and the short of what we see. I guess like the northern and southern lights. Or Aurora Borealis. That true. That's also plasma. But that's kind of it, right? And of course, the northern lights, most of us will never see. But that's not a common thing that we see. So most people are not witnessing any kind of crazy, worldwide plasma or solar system-wide plasma event ever, really. Most people will never even see a comet. I only saw my first comet a little bit ago. It was awesome, but it took me forever. So we do not have a frame of reference for anything that our ancestors were talking about. But this is what they're describing. They're describing a scientific event that they just had to sit back and watch, and there was nothing they could do. So when Mars shows up, it has its debris trail, just as we should expect. That is more corroboration for the Venus event. So when Mars shows up, of course, Mars gets close enough to where some of that debris is going to hit Earth, and it does. Right? It's not the end of the world situation, though there are those kind of cults that will spring up. Don't get me wrong, they exist. But generally speaking, people are not as afraid of Mars as they were of Venus. At least that's the impression that I get. I don't know if you can make an argument too good against that. You could try, but Venus is a whole other level of terror. I can't imagine how close Venus must have actually come to Earth. And you also have to remember, Venus was in a cometary form when our ancestors saw it. Mars does not appear to be in a cometary form, as far as I can tell. I'm open to evidence to the contrary, but nobody really seems to describe Mars as the hairy star, right? Mars isn't doing any of that, and this might make sense as well. And the reason why, okay, let's check this out. More evidence to prove that these catastrophes are real. The reason why Venus was inevitably in a cometary form is because Venus still had a good charge. It still had an electrical charge. As Venus was approaching the sun, Venus had to shed charge to acclimate to the electrical environment. So what happens when you shed charge? You get a comet. Right? That's all that is. When you see a comet tail, that is not dirty ice and snow or whatever garbage the mainstream still tries to say. That's plasma. That's just plasma. It's just plasma and debris, right? It's plasma and dust. It's energized dust. That's all that is. Venus would have been in the same state, just on a planetary scale. So when our ancestors are seeing that, right, you see a planet-sized comet and it's heading towards you, yeah, that's a whole other level of fear. I don't think people truly appreciate how unbelievably horrifying that event was. I mean, that would have had to have been a whole level of insanity. And to make it worse, right, we cross through Venus's tail multiple times. Right, this is where you get your 6 days of night or whatever the hell it is in a lot of the stories, because we enter the tail. Right, we're just everything is just dark because we are literally in Venus's tail for a certain period of time. Right, and we're getting hammered with material from Venus. And also, I know I was supposed to be talking about Mars, but the Venus event is crazy. And apparently in the Venus event, we get so close that you can see the glowing head of Venus in the sky glowing like the sun. That's how close we get to it, and it's huge. Like, yeah, crazy. Anyway, so that's a whole other level of terror. Mars doesn't do any of that. And the reason why Mars doesn't do any of that is because it sounds like during that Venus event, Mars was present, and like I said, Venus zaps Mars. When that zapping happens, when there's a thunderbolt that is exchanged between Venus and Mars, that is where Mars loses its electromagnetic field. That's where that electromagnetic field disappears. Venus destroys it. Right? This is just basic electrical principles. There's nothing crazy going on here. Everybody's got to acclimate to your electrical environment. It's impossible not to. You have to. So when Mars and Venus got close enough, they acclimated, and Mars got absolutely slapped around. Mars was discharged. Mars lost its electromagnetic field. Mostly. It's still kind of there, but it used to have a better one, basically. So, when Mars starts to approach Earth, it does not go into a cometary mode. Why? Because it's already neutralized. It doesn't have a charge anymore. It doesn't matter. So that's why Mars is not a comet. But Mars is still trailing debris from the Valles Marines event. See how all this lines up? You see how this chronology works? Like, if any of this was fake, we should not find any of this stuff lining up scientifically. But this is what we find. We find our ancestors' eyewitness testimony, essentially, describing what happens, and then when we look at it through a scientific perspective ourselves, we see why what happens, and then we can even make predictions. If Mars was indeed neutralized, like our ancestors claim, or claim they saw anyways, they didn't realize it was being neutralized. They're just telling us what they saw. The thunderbolt. We could then infer that yes, Mars got neutralized then. So Mars should not have an electromagnetic field. Sure enough, Mars does not have an electromagnetic field. So if Mars approaches Earth and it no longer has a sufficient charge to matter, right, we should expect nothing to happen. We should expect there not to be any kind of a cometary presence. We should expect not to see any real attraction either. It's a neutralized body. And this is exactly what people experienced about 1,000 years ago. Now, I don't want to get too crazy into the actual catastrophes relative to Mars, but our ancestors have to deal with this. 12-year intervals. I'm not quite sure how long this goes on. Like I said, maybe a century-ish or so, probably less. I would guess less. This goes relatively fast. Another thing everybody has to remember is that these planetary bodies are not being guided by gravity. Right? It's electromagnetism. Electromagnetism is 10 to the 38 times more powerful than gravity, which means that it works quick. Right? This stuff is happening fast. The solar system is cleaning itself up fast. The solar system is organizing itself quickly. This is the power of electromagnetism. Right? It's insane. It happens quick. So, in one lifetime, you could have grown up seeing Mars fly by close. And then by the time you're on your way out, to die, Mars could have just been a speck in the sky. Or you may have been able to witness that in a lifetime. That's possible. Now, this brings us to the possible explanation as to where Jonathan Swift got his information from. So, Mars does its flybys. During these flybys, there are a couple of times, or a few times, to where there is some decent catastrophes that happen. Right? They're nowhere on the scale of the Venus event, but we do find, possibly islands sinking. We do find some shorelines, small sections of shorelines, either sinking or being risen up. We find little catastrophes like that, relatively speaking, little. Right? If we experienced this in the modern age, it would be the end of the world for us. Right? But to the Venus event people, this is child's play. Anyway, Mars causes problems. Now, aside from the common problems, weather patterns being disrupted, earthquakes, tsunamis, all that crazy basic stuff, another problem that everybody describes happening is, of course, the stars raining down from the sky. And this is what we would expect to happen as well if Mars was indeed trailing a debris field. So right now, when we look at Mars, it does not have a debris field. It's got its 2 moons. So where the hell did the debris go? It's entirely possible that when Mars makes contact with Earth multiple times, that this is where the debris ultimately goes. Scientists wonder, where did these Mars rocks come from? And everybody nowadays in the mainstream takes it for granted that, oh yeah, Mars rocks can just be, launched off of Mars and magically fly over to Earth. Astronomers, their explanation is simply, well, there must have been an impact, or I don't know, I guess maybe a volcano, some of them might say, and, all those rocks just get blown off, and eventually over millions and billions of years, 1 or 2 will land on Earth. And that explanation is generally acceptable to the vast majority of people. The problem is that skirts around the problem of the amount of kinetic energy required to launch a Mars rock off the surface of Mars. Right? It's not that simple. If you have that kind of an impact, you have other problems on Mars, and we would see it. And we don't see what we would expect to see if that level of an energetic impact had taken place on Mars. What this actually means is that an impact cannot be responsible for what we see today. You can actually watch astronomers glaze over when somebody presses them on this question, because the impact required is just mind-boggling. And we would see the effects right now on Mars of such an impact. So, we have a problem though. Where the hell did all these Mars rocks come from? Because they're here on Earth. And I'm willing to bet there's tons more here on Earth than we know about, simply because Earth is covered in Mars rock, and we just think this stuff is native to Earth. We'll talk about that in a sec maybe. Anyway, so where did all the debris go on Mars? Well, Mars is close enough to Earth to where Earth attracts a lot of this stuff. And of course, our ancestors make this exact claim. They say when we get close to Mars, all of those demons, all of those warriors, all of those horses in the sky, they start to fall to Earth. Earth is probably the primary cleaner of that debris field. Okay? So that's where the debris probably went. Now, I'm sure we did not clean up all of it. Mars would still have several more centuries of flying around to lose it. But there you go. Right? We have a cleaning event that would have scrubbed Mars mostly of what it had. Earth is the scrubber, right? Earth is the punisher, or got punished. Right? Earth, we took all that stuff. I would not be surprised if you just went outside your house and you walked into your field or mountains or something. You might be stepping on Martian soil everywhere you go. Right? Whenever I go hiking out in the hills, you always see all these weird rocks everywhere. Sometimes I wonder, is this stuff from Mars? Because when you look at Mars rock and you look at some of the stuff here on Earth, it's like, well, they look identical. Now, that doesn't mean anything. My main point is that if there was all that debris falling, into Earth or onto Earth, it's possible that there's a lot of geology on the surface of the Earth that we are just mistaking as regular Earth rocks and Earth strata and stuff, when in reality, a lot of it might actually, or not a lot of it, but some of that stuff just might be from Mars. right? And we're just so used to thinking that it's from the Earth, and anyway, I'm not going to get into the geological science of that. It's just something to think about. We'll talk about that on another show. Anyway, so as Mars does its multiple pass-bys, eventually it's going to leave. We know this because Mars is not doing it now. Mars has a completely different orbit today than it did, 1,000 years ago, obviously. So that means eventually Mars will disengage, and Mars will disengage with a cleaner, orbit, because Earth took it all. So when Mars begins to eventually disengage, and the survivors and the people are watching this go away, there's a really good chance that as Mars was departing, you could still see Phobos and Deimos. You would not need a telescope. It's right there. You don't need it. You could just look up there with the naked eye and you could see those two bodies orbiting Mars. So, and this was probably, maybe 800 years ago, 700 years ago, not that long ago. The reason why this matters is because if somebody records this, now remember, people would have been writing stuff during this point in time. Some civilizations were destroyed, but not everybody is destroyed. Most people are just shooken up to one degree or another, right? So you still have complex civilizations recording these events. It is entirely possible that Jonathan Swift would eventually get his hands on some kind of a book that recorded these events and that recorded what Mars had orbiting around it as it left Earth, because that is what our ancestors saw. Now, one of the points you can make against me, like I said at the beginning of this video, is you could say, yeah, but wait a second, he got only close to the orbits, which is impressive, you got to admit that, but he did not have the exact orbits. For whatever reason, whatever source he had very specific numbers, right? And he records those numbers, and he has no way to test it because he can't see it, right? He can't confirm it. He's just going off of whatever historical source he has, right? So he does. But the rotations are slightly off. The orbits are off. Why? Well, this is another thing we would expect to find. If things are changing dynamically all the time, remember with the planets, Phobos and Deimos also would have been altered over time. Phobos and Deimos, after Mars disengages from Earth, they saw those orbits as what Swift describes originally. However, over the next few centuries, as Mars finds its current orbit, those orbits would more than likely be altered, right? They would shift a little bit as everybody continues to orient themselves and acclimate themselves to their electrical environment. So in theory, we actually should expect the orbits of Phobos and Deimos to change. Not by a lot, and they don't change by a lot. They change only a little bit. What this means is that proves the dynamic nature of cosmology, right? That this is what we would expect. So is it possible that Jonathan Swift had access to some kind of historical information that you and I just don't have anymore, right? It probably still exists. It's just locked up in the Vatican or God knows where else right now, right? I'm willing to bet that. I'm willing to bet that kind of literature exists and you and I will never see it. But Jonathan Swift got his hands on some of that. Now, it might have been easier back during his period of time, the 1700s, because it was harder to lock everything down. He may have easily gotten access to some sort of a historical document. And who knows what else he had access to? Who knows? He could have had access to all kinds of cool stuff, and maybe some other stuff in his book is real, but it's just too crazy for us to think of being real. Right, and that's a separate thing entirely, but it's just something to think about. So when we look at something like the zero event thesis, we need evidence. We need the science and we need the eyewitness testimony. And here is more of it. Gulliver's Travels, oddly enough, provides us with real scientific information that fills in gaps relative to the events of the zero event. It fills in some of the gaps relative to the positions of Mars. Alright, yeah, so I just wanted to point this stuff out. It's just more scientific evidence that corroborates all of these crazy catastrophic events that our ancestors describe as being real historical truths. So when you guys are out there reading your, doing your studies and reading all this crazy stuff, don't forget, if you're reading some book from the 1800s and they say something about the planets that sounds crazy, hold on. Maybe those guys are going off of some kind of older information that was accurate at some point in time in history. This is the stuff we need to keep digging for. And now, the voices in my head are telling me to end this show because I have said too much.